Hi everyone, welcome to Whitebird Trials, Filmmakers and Their Films. So today we are going to talk about Kenji Mizoguchi, and this session is going to be discussed by a well-known critic and author, which is Raghavendra sir. Over to you, sir.
Now, the thing of Japanese cinema was an extension of theater, not an extension of photography. Now, this is also true of Indian cinema, which is an extension of theater. But the thing was, the theater was a very different thing in Japan and a different thing in India, not quite the same thing. They had completely different basis in these two in India and Japan. Okay, so that means that Japanese cinema is not very much like Indian cinema. Okay, it's not at all actually. Okay, another important thing is that in the Japanese theater there was a commentator called the benshi. Okay, there was always a commentator, and that commentator would give the kind of thing in the speech. So when cinema came, foreign movies mainly, and a lot of films had these commentators who would actually intervene, or rather mediate between the audience and the what is being shown on the screen. And this happened especially in foreign movies. And the story goes that they could turn a tragedy into a comedy and that kind of thing. That they were such adept at this sort of thing that if they didn't like you or didn't like the film or something, they could turn it completely whatever way, especially foreign movies. Okay, they were called the benchies. Okay, now the important thing here is in cinema, Japanese cinema. Let's look at the earliest cinema, right? Um, there is no there is no illusion of space. Look, in the Western, in the normal thing of cinema, because it's photography, there's an illusion of space. That is, you want to enter the space. The camera enters the space. There is, like, for example, you have the tracking shot and all this kind of thing. Tracking shot inward. I don't mean this kind of tracking shot was there in thing also. But this inward tracking shot entering the space kind of thing, that you're actually entering a three-dimensional space. That is a fundamental thing of Western cinema, right? If you look at especially something like the Russians, for instance, if you look at the Russian cinema, the early silent cinema of Pudovkin and Eisenstein and all that, that illusion of space is maximum, right? Even in stuff like Griffith and all this, so that was a definite aspect of Western cinema. But Japanese cinema was like a frame, okay, in the sense that this frame was pictorial. Now, if you want to look at this, what is the difference between a film frame and a pictorial picture frame? A film frame and the frame of a painting. The basic thing is the film frame, the picture frame, the frame of the painting is completely contains everything which is there in the painting. You understand the meaning of the word contained? There is nothing. It is not something, it completely contains everything. Whereas, okay, the photographic frame does not contain anything. It contains what is left out, right? I don't know. For example, let's look at the caption of a picture, of a painting, and the caption of a photograph. They're completely different things, right? The caption of a photograph is only telling you the occasion, telling you what is this, what you absolutely need to know what it is. Simply a photograph may not be. I mean, these artistic photographs are possible. For example, you look at something like Cartier-Bresson's pictures of India. Have you seen them around 1947 and little after partition violence and all that? Without being told what is there in the picture, right? Being told what is there in the picture, you will not be able to say what this picture is about. It's very necessary. This is not true of your of paintings. For example, untitled is a fairly common title to give paintings. Okay, so the purpose of the pictorial, the photographic frame, the photographic caption is very different from the title of the painting. Right? It's very different. In fact, what is his name? John Berger. Have you heard of John Berger? John Berger did a thing on there was a photograph of Che Guevara, right? That photograph of Che Guevara with dead body lying there, surrounded by colonels and generals from the army, exhibiting his body to the public. Dead body photograph. I mean, there's a photograph. So Berger wrote a whole essay on that photograph. Okay, he said that this entire essay about this photograph is actually a kind of photo caption. It's a caption. It works as a caption to the picture, right? To the photograph. So Andre Bazin, okay, said that the basic difference is that the uh, frame of the photograph is actually like a mask. It masks. It's a kind of thing or masking of a thing of a piece of reality, and that thing suggests all the rest of it, which is masked off. Okay, so that is what he called it, mask. Okay, this was the name he said that the frame of the photograph works like that. Okay, now so the question is, when you come to cinema, drama is very important in Western cinema, okay, in American cinema and all that. In Japanese cinema, not so much drama. Okay, it's more pictorial. It's done in a completely different way. There's a certain distance maintained. Okay, I think Ozu, you could see that kind of drama that you have in Kurosawa, who was a later day person, Kurosawa. You have a lot of drama in Kurosawa. You won't have such drama in somebody like Ozu or in a person like Mizoguchi, who are earlier filmmakers who were part of the Japanese filmmaking tradition. Okay. So I mean, one of the things was Bazinian theorists favored deep focus and the uncut sequence over montage. You get that thing, no? The one of the reasons was montage they felt was like expressionistic in the sense it was rather making connections when none existed. So what was the thing was the meaning was, okay, that there are two aspects of cinema. One aspect is the capture of reality. Yeah, that is what's called realism, and this entire thing of mise en scène, which is to capture what is in front of the camera, including set design. It could like set design would be like, for example, Caligari would be expressionist set design, but it's basically still mise en scène, right? Miscenscene. Montage is cutting. Okay, now the thing is, montage is was a way that the Russians used to produce meaning when none was there. They thought that meaning was produced. They believed that meaning was produced by juxtaposition of images. Okay, like for example, one of the things was a man looking at looking cut to food, right? And the man looking at the immediately that thing becomes hunger. So the meaning, a man looking at it, slightly sick looking man staring at a bad cut to a thing, a chicken or something like that, food, no, would be a way of expressing hunger. So the question, man plus food would make hunger. There's an experiment which was, I think, Kuleshov did, which he cut the clown's face to various the same face to various different objects to produce hunger, love, various things were entirely based on this, the cutting technique. That was the basic thing of the Russian cinema. Okay. Now the question is, in Japanese cinema, this montage is not important because the entire thing is based on the beauty of the frame, and the frame is like the pictorial frame, the frame of the painting. It's not very difficult. Okay. Now, when you come to see, one of the things of Bazin is, supposing you want to show, he said, a tiger and a man, you have them in the same frame. That is a certain tension because of the tiger and the man. Whereas if you man and you cut it to cut to the tiger, the tension is lost. The same thing with violence. So when you push somebody and the entire thing is caught, it has a certain what do you say, a certain tension which will be missing in the cut sequence, right? In Japanese cinema, these dichotomies don't exist. Okay. So Mizoguchi used cinema in this way, and he used the uncut sequence very effectively. But basically, it's an expression of beauty in some way. Okay. He uses it for emotional impact. He uses now. What would be the most? Have any of you seen the films of Max Ophuls? Have you seen? Max Ophuls, have you heard of him? Ophuls? You've not heard of him? He is a great influence on Stanley Kubrick. Ophuls, I don't know if you're a film institute student. No, they haven't taught you Earrings of Madame Da. They didn't show you the Earrings of Madame Da.
I'm
Madame Da,
not
no,
aware of it. So I'm
you're
not
not aware.
aware.
What about this thing, Letter from an Unknown Woman? It's there on YouTube. Please write it down.
I'll have a look.
Have a
Yes,
look at
yes,
it.
yes.
Letter from an Unknown Woman. It's on YouTube. Please look at this. It's Ophuls, one of his masterpieces, two or three masterpieces he's got. The way he uses the uncut sequence is very different from Mizoguchi. Okay, Mizoguchi uses it as a kind of emotional thing. He uses it as a kind of beauty to emphasize tradition and all that, right? That kind of thing. Okay, this is his basic thing of using the. When you come to um, the actual content of Mizoguchi's films, he was a traditionalist. Okay, he was a traditionalist, and he was deeply mindful of, especially of the status of women in Japanese society. He was very mindful of that. His own sister was sold as a geisha, which meant that I mean, so you can see that condition of women, prostitutes are a big subject in his movies. Okay, he keeps using them all the time. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. Okay. Now, unlike, I mean, more than Kurosawa or Ozu, Kurosawa is a later filmmaker. He was Kobayashi. Kurosawa, the second generation after this Mizoguchi, Ozu guys. Another guy is Naruse, Mikio Naruse. Have you heard of Mikio Naruse? There are 4 or 5 of the earlier. Naruse also 30s, 40s, 50s he worked. Okay, they're all traditional filmmakers, slightly melodramatic. There's a guy called Gosho, I think, something Gosho. I think these are all the important early filmmakers. Kurosawa, Kobayashi, and all these were slightly later filmmakers. Further later filmmakers with the Japanese new wave, which were people like the guy who did Oshima, Nagisa Oshima. Okay, who did Ballad of Narayama. Okay, whatever. These are the Ballad of Narayama, the second version I'm talking about, not the first version. Okay. So the basic thing was Mizoguchi is a political filmmaker, unlike Kurosawa and unlike Ozu. Ozu is dealing with interpersonal relationships, but these interpersonal relationships are not overwritten by class distinctions, by structure, hierarchical structure, and all that. In Kurosawa's, not in Kuro, no, in Mizoguchi's films, hierarchical structure is a very key notion, and it keeps working. It keeps, it has very important. Okay. Now let's look at 2, 3 movies of Ozu, early movies. That is before the war. One is Sisters of Gion, about Gion, which is about 2 sisters. One who is very traditional, and the other who is the younger one who is taken more modern. Okay, she wants to use her position with her lovers and all that various ways to extract whatever she can. The first is a great believer of tradition, and she actually supports her bankrupt boss or whatever. No, the bankrupt patron, right? He supports him, keeps him in her house, and tries to look after him because he was once looking after her. He looks after him. So she's very, very, and this entire thing of of people who are bankrupted employers being helped by their former employees and all that is a very key notion in this guy. So the question is, the important thing is that they have great belief in tradition in Mizoguchi's early films. This great belief in tradition. I mean, this is important, I'll tell you, because his later films are very different. Okay, the great thing of tradition is it is not. He's not actually what is it called upholding tradition as a great. He's aware of the tragic destinies that tradition sort of enforces on people, right? That he is aware of that, but the point is, he still thinks because there is nothing else, okay, that you have to deal with tradition, you have to accept it, was his basic thing. Which doesn't mean he's not an apologist for tradition. It doesn't mean that he is going to say that tradition is going to make you. In fact, the thing is, in a lot of these stories, okay, see, the apologist and the rebel are somewhat similar. The rebel, you don't rebel unless you have a utopia in mind, right? Marxist rebels, for instance, had this utopia. Okay, they always have something. Maoism. What is Maoism? You have a Maoist utopia in mind, right? They're rebels, right? Anarchism had some kind of a utopia, was there is no government. Okay, there is no government, society will come by itself. This absence of government itself is a kind of utopia. Marxists had this thing of the communist utopia where there will be no money, there will be no, the state will wither away. These are the things. All of them have utopias. Okay, so it is in the utopia is what they expect society to be. You can say that all left wing have this kind of utopia. If you look at the apologist, he tries to show it as it should be, right? Okay, Apologist as it is intended to be, the rebel as it should be. Okay, these are the two particular thing. Rebels usually believe in utopia. So when it comes to Mizoguchi, he was neither. In the sense, he was trying to. He was while he was a traditionalist. He was a traditionalist. You could say. I mean, I don't know whom you could. Is there any Indian person who went fit the bill as some person who is a traditional filmmaker who is not a rebel in some way? Maybe Satyajit Ray in some sense. I don't know. In some sense, he's not a rebel, obviously. But the question is, he's very truthful to whatever he's doing. Of course, his method of filmmaking is not in any traditional Indian kind of thing. It's probably more. He's not a rebel at the same time. He's not an apologist. He's probably more truthful about India than most other filmmakers, right? He doesn't expect some, paint the working class in glorious colors. So a little bit of idealization is there, but still, it's probably is more than most of the others. Okay. Now the point is, yeah. So the point is, okay, Mizoguchi accepts social conventions, but is honest enough to see that the harm that the traditional society can do to certain classes of people, of which women, probably geisha women, that sort of thing would be a very typical category. Okay. Now, when you come to his uncut sequence, I would like to, you have a look at when you go back, you have a look at before the next class, have a look at this Ophuls' letter from an unknown woman, which is available on YouTube. But this uncut sequence, I would like to point out. Did you see Story of the Last Chrysanthemums? I think the print is not too good, right? Okay. There's one scene in the end when he's looking for the train. You remember that scene? When he's searching for her Omo, I think what is her name? Otoka or something. Otoka, right? Otoku,
Otoku,
right?
Otoku.
Otoku.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
searching for her on the train. She's supposed to be on the train with him going to his father. She's
Hmm.
not there, right? So that uncut sequence is there when the camera is inside the train. You remember that scene? Have you remember this particular scene? Okay, he's the camera is inside the train and he's on the platform running this side, that side. I think the train is a constructed thing. It's not really a train. It's a set. So he's running this side and that side trying to find her. And the camera keeps up until the train is about to leave. Till that time, he's anxious, his anxiety looking for her. But at last moment, when the train is about to leave, somebody pushes him, and then you have a cut, and then the whole emotion is changed. So the point I'm trying to make is that this scene, you can see the way he uses the cut, and at the point where the emotion is going to change. This you won't find in what's his name in Ophuls. You won't find this sort of thing. In Ophuls, it's basically very similar to the space trying to catch reality, right? He cuts because the business of carrying on thing when the in a shall we say in a complicated space, in a cluttered space, you can't move a camera, therefore he cuts it because it's very difficult. Okay, so his thing is there's no change of mood in Ophuls' films. There's no change of mood when the cut occurs. Okay, here there is actually he's using the cut to change the mood in a particular way, and you have a look at this. Okay, now, the story of the last chrysanthemums, in terms of content, is about a young actor who is to follow his father's footsteps, in his father's footsteps, but he has no talent. His father's troop, they make fun of him behind his back, but praise him to his face, right? Okay. The point is that he has to the relationship between the father and the son is somewhat like between a prince and a king, right? The prince, apart from being the king's son, is also a subject of the king. You get me, right? Which means that he is okay. The king is actually the monarch. Is sort of the question is the relationship is to here. Here it's somewhat like that. He's the adopted son. The son is the adopted son. So that even if he has to talk to his father, he has to talk like a Vasilis. There's always mediated between him and the father by members of the troop. So he's like a member of the troop, though he's given more respect by the members because he's an adopted son. His basic position is not very different. Now he doesn't have very much talent. He's generally made fun of. But the point is that father has got another child now. Okay, that child has got a wet nurse, and that woman is commences a relationship with the young actor, and the result of which is kicked out, and he also leaves and goes away with her. That's the basic story. Okay, and she helps him and she tries to be supporting him all the time that he's an actor. Obviously, she comes from a different class. She doesn't belong to the same class. Finally, when the sacrifice has to be made, she actually stays away. She's not prepared to go along with him because she won't be accepted. She would rather, not that he's not a good, he's already become a good actor. But the important thing is he's already got a place waiting for him in his father's thing. All he has to do is apologize to his father and he will be accepted. She will not be accepted. Okay. So to give him his place in the traditional hierarchy, she is prepared to sacrifice herself and she realizes and she goes away. I mean, she's also sick, by the way. She's got tuberculosis and she's dying of tuberculosis. But the important thing is that the important thing here is tradition must be obeyed for whatever reason. It doesn't guarantee you anything. Okay. See, one of the thing is there's bankrupt, like you have in the Sisters of Gion, the bankrupt businessman and all that tells you that tradition is not necessarily loaded in such a way. Okay, it's not loaded in such a way that people who are at the top will not fall. There is some this thing there. Okay, they also go bankrupt, and tradition is sort of it doesn't guarantee you very much. But the point is, those people at the top, they may be there right now. They're at the top. Those who could become beggars is also an issue. Is there? Okay, this is the basic thing. So the question is, tradition doesn't guarantee you anything at all. Okay, it doesn't guarantee you anything at all, but at the same time, because it's all you have got, you have to follow it. This is the basic the basic thing in this fellow's early movies. Okay, so the question is that they all accept tradition as the only way. They are, how to put it, it's like the tragedy, like, if you look at Mahabharata, if you look at the Mahabharata. Okay, Mahabharata may have an ideology in some way, but basically Mahabharata, it sort of tries to, what is it called, inflict some kind of fairness, in the sense, okay, some people suffer more, some people are at the top, other people are lower, other people, that kind of thing is there. But still there is a basic fundamental belief that dharma is the kind of thing, that dharma will ultimately be fair. It's not completely fair, but it's the only thing we have got. We've got a thing in the Mahabharata. It's somewhat like that, except that the principles are very different. It's a kind of fundamental belief. I don't mean a modern version of the Mahabharata where things are reversed and that sort of thing. I mean that fundamental belief in the epic of destiny being impartial in some way, right? Destiny or karma is impartial. That somehow something has happened, so in the long run, everybody in some way they will get their deserts, or they will have to pay the price. The rich are not going to be saved because this karma is something which could happen to anybody. Anybody, everybody is subject to karma. It's somewhat like that, you could say. Okay. Can you recommend some books on what on Japanese cinema? There is one famous book, only only on Japanese cinema. Just check it out. Like, I'll tell you what, okay, you just the number of books on Japanese cinema. There is this site called LibGen. Are you familiar? Library Genesis. Are you familiar with that site? Okay, just check it out. You'll find you in that books thing, no? Textbooks or something, academic books or something, you will find. You just type in Japanese cinema. I think there's an introduction to Japanese cinema, the introduction to French cinema. You'll find you just have to put these keywords, Japanese cinema or French cinema, and you'll get it. Or if you want a general book, there is this book called How to Read a Film. Okay, that's an interesting book. How to Read a Film by Monaco. That's a good book. I would recommend that you people have a look at that book. Okay, we will go to the the effect of the war on Japan, right? Okay, that's war and its aftermath. Now, Japanese surrender was announced in 45. It was announced by the emperor. Nobody had heard the emperor's voice at all, He was considered a living god. The emperor was a living god, okay. Nobody had heard his voice at all. So it came as a big shock to them. The first time they heard his movement, that you have heard his voice, and he was announcing the surrender of Japan. Okay, after the Hiroshima, Nagasaki. So the question is, it was the first time that Japan had been occupied by a foreign power. Now, what happened was, once it was occupied, the basic thing was the economic reforms were carried out. It was a very feudal thing, right? Feudal power, where there was certain landed aristocracy was there, and they were actually driving the nation's what do you say, military decisions and all that, military policy, its warlike policy was actually behind it were these feudal chieftains. Okay, you see Kurosawa and all this, you come across these castles and all that which are occupied by these feudal chieftains. There was one emperor above everybody else, but these feudal chieftains were ruling the roost. So what they did was, the first thing they did was to dismantle the feudal structure. Okay, they took the land, the Americans and all that, the occupying forces. They took away the land of the feudals and sold it to the at very small, low prices. They sold it to the tillers. It was actually a very, shall we say, a very radical. You can imagine what will happen. You take a country's, a major portion of the land and you sell it off to the tillers. What will happen to the economic structure, right? Okay, it's the same. So the question is, what happened was 3 million per, I believe 1940, about 1950, I think, 3 million peasants had purchased land. The power of the landlords was broken. Okay. The new constitution in 1946 began to democratize Japan. The position of women was strengthened. Some American women came in and they started writing the reforms bill and all that, equal rights bill and all they wrote, in order to make the Japanese woman's condition much better. So you can imagine, what will happen, what would happen to a feudal society which has never seen defeat before, right? Which has never seen where the king is revered as a god, as a living god. What will happen to that kind of society, right? What you can imagine what will happen to that society when so obviously there were huge changes. The important thing is these changes are visible in Mizoguchi's films, and Kurosawa, okay, came out of this post-war situation. Okay, see, I told you about the question is. Kurosawa has various things like point of view, right? You take something like Rashomon. It is revolutionary in Japan because it uses point of view. Now, point of view is pretty commonplace Western, right? It doesn't mean anything at all. Kurosawa, in fact, I don't know whether you're aware of this. When you look at Rashomon, for instance, there's a general belief that Rashomon is talking about the illusoriness of absolute truth. There is no such thing as that. That is not the thing at all. It's not a philosophical tract like that. It's an introduction of the fact. In fact, the thing is not like that. People cannot be believed is the thing. That people tell lies to further their own agendas is the basic thing. So that entire thing of doubt, which is, I mean, if you see the opening, I don't know, if you've seen the framing sequence of Kurosawa's Rashomon, it's rain, okay, something is happening, it's very gloomy, right? Okay. It is not some kind of Advaitist thing on absolute truth being non-existent. It is not that. It's not an Advaitist thing at all. It is more a kind of thing on subjectivity, on the fact that whatever has been, look, you've got to understand this, that the entire Japanese thing was a great belief in faith, in truth, in empire, in this and that, right? When you start doing this and you start talking about subjectivity, it has a completely political meaning, which is more a lack of faith, a new lack of faith in what was believed in. It's more like that. Okay. It can't be seen, shall we say, as irrelevant to context. Context is not irrelevant in the film. Okay. So the question is that Kurosawa came out of this. His movies came out of this. Mizoguchi is more interesting than Kurosawa simply because his post-war and his pre-war movies are very different. Okay. So you just look at the thing. Now let's look at his post-war movies. Let's look at the post-war movies. Have all of you seen Life of Oharu? This I would rate this one and Sancho the Bailiff, the two greatest movies that I would go put Sancho the Bailiff also. I'll tell you why also, why I think so. Um, Sancho the Bailiff and Life of Oharu are the greatest movies that Mizoguchi made. In this one is actually about an old woman. Okay, it begins as a flashback. Again, look at that flashback. Okay, it's not normally used in Japanese cinema earlier. Have you seen flashbacks in, by and large, in Ozu's films? I don't know. Have you seen that? Not that I can think of. Okay, flashbacks. It could be there. I don't know, but it seems to be. Think of memory of subjectivity and all that. I can't recall flashbacks in Ozu's films, right? Here, the thing is, in the earlier movies, are there flashbacks? I think there are. Are there flashbacks in first two movies? Look, I'm just feeling my way around. I'm not too sure about this. You have to check out on this. What are the effects, the formal effects that the post-war movies, pre-war movies, formally how the movies changed from the pre-war things. Okay, I can't give you a straightforward thing. It would make a lot of sense for you to look at these movies and examine them, right? Always. And nothing. I don't know Japanese tradition so well as to be able to tell you that this is the difference, that is the difference. Okay. The important thing is, yeah, I don't. I also don't think so. I also don't think there are flashbacks. I think flashback introduces an element of subjectivity, which these guys, the Japanese, don't have that kind of thing, right? The point is that this Oharu becomes a mistress of somebody. Okay, she's actually, there's a page boy in love with her. He's in love with her. He wants to marry her, but because she's a lady in the court, she's a lady in the court of that local prince or whatever. This page has no business to fall in love with her. The page is executed. Okay, so the question is, he's executed, and because she has fallen in love with him, she's also kicked out of there, right? So what happens is she has to go back to her father. The father, because she has had a position, has made debts and all that in the expectation that he can prepay those debts out of the money he can get out of her, but he can't. So the point is, what can he do? She becomes a, what is it called? She becomes a courtesan. Okay, the courtesan is that she has to bear the child of a lord, of a feudal lord. Okay, because that man doesn't have sons, she has to go and become pregnant by him and give birth to his son, and after that she's sent away, given some small, you just see the way this is treated. Like, the point is, she's given some small compensation and sent away, and then she, one by one and one by one, all her things start she sinks lower and lower, becomes a prostitute. But then when she becomes prostitute, by the time she becomes, this is about some 20, 15, 20 years later, she marries somebody, the husband is murdered, tries to start a shop, he's murdered, so she's unlucky there. So what happens is, some 20, 15, 20 years later, when her that feudal lord is dead, okay, his son has taken over, she is called back, because she can't be a prostitute anymore. Okay, she can't be, because it is not, I think, for the mother of some lord of something to be working as a prostitute. So she's taken back, and then she's supposed to meet her son and thank him for having given her the opportunity of bearing him. You can imagine the entire thing, right? So he is supposed to bear, he has born her, she has born him, therefore she has to thank him. But the point is, here again, okay, just look at this. Now this entire thing is comic. Even in the entire thing is comic. The feudal lord is no longer somebody in power. He is, when he's walking around, he can't even say hello to his mother. He's got surrounded by these people. You've all seen this film now. He's surrounded by these people who are all walking behind him, walking in front, walking beside him, walking this, going through the rituals and all that. She can't even meet him. She tries to go near, she can't, she's shooed away, right? So the point is that finally, again, she has to thank him. I don't think he's in a position to receive a thanks, even because she has to. I mean, so the question is, he's surrounded by officialdom. He has no freedom himself. So now you see that Mizoguchi is sort of making he's making fun of this entire thing, of this tradition. It is, you can see that it's slightly different. It is no longer like what it was. The mother, like in the normal thing, what mother, there would be some kind of respect for the mother. Something would happen. The story would be different. The son might have. I think you probably look at Naruse, you will find mother-son kind of relationship. The son respects the mother. Okay, that sort of thing happens, but they are kept apart because tradition says the mother can be this, the son could be that. I can imagine other ways by which this relationship between mother and son would be done in this film. I can imagine other ways. Okay, for the son and realizing his duties. Just imagine the situation. His duties are calling him. He has to attend to things he cannot. Though his mother is there, he cannot do anything. That sort of thing. So you would, that the moral there would be that tradition is cruel, but tradition is all we have got, would have been the thing. But now the question is, he can't even see her because he's surrounded by people. So now it's slightly become comic. There's actually some debunking of the system here, which wasn't there earlier. Okay. After this, what happens is, okay, she's an aged prostitute now, and she's employed by a group of pilgrims. And the reason she's employed by the group of pilgrims is to demonstrate to these pilgrims how flesh is weak. Okay, she's so painted over and so hideous looking that these pilgrims, the older pilgrim employs her to communicate to the younger pilgrims that women don't go near women, and shows her as the object of disgust in some way. That disgusting kind of thing. Stay away from women, that kind of thing. When she sees it, that she's actually, he calls her goblin cat. When she sees it, she makes something like a goblin cat, right? He calls her a goblin cat. And she's actually, she's seeing the comedy in that whole situation, that she's now so ugly and so painted over and so old that she's no longer an object of desire at all, right? And she's actually some kind of moral thing about the repulsiveness of the flesh. That the flesh is not really something to be desired. It's actually a kind of moral, standing moral. Okay, but instead of being a tragic thing, she herself makes fun of it as a goblin cat. Okay, as weakness of the flesh. So you can see that the entire thing has changed. Okay. Now, in his films, the tracking sequence and the sharp cut are no longer there. The tracking sequence, that beauty of the thing is they're not there. Actually, this film is, I mean, that kind of beauty which is there in the early movies are definitely some kind of, is no longer there, which doesn't mean that it's ugly in any way. But the point is that striving after the pictorial beauty of the earlier films is no longer there in this particular film. It's actually quite, how do you put it? It's a very, the portrayal is quite ghastly in many ways. I mean, within the framework of Japanese thing, right? Okay. Now the question is, the question is, there is character memory for the first time in Japanese cinema. For what I mean, I'm not sure about this. You will have to check it out. This thing of character memory motivating the flashback. This is the first time that you can see this in Mizoguchi's film, for as far as I can make out. Okay. As I said, Rashomon also makes use of character memory in some way to about the unreliability of what we call truth. The unreliability of accepted truth is the way I would deal with Rashomon, not the Advaitist thing of there being no such thing as objective truth. Okay. It is more the unreliability of so-called objective truth is the way I would see it. Okay, that is the way I would see it. Okay. Okay, so the point is that an entire thing is this feeling of this class differences have become very strong, and the fact is tradition, which was once that the higher owed something to the lower. Look, there are some very funny things in this thing, right? I mean, which wouldn't have been there in the earlier movies. One, I remember when the guy comes along, one rider comes along to take her back to the Lord or to escort to the Lord. The man who is sent is a very old man. Okay. They're afraid that there is a young man, he could have a relationship with a woman or some kind of sexual thing with a woman. So they send some old man, so all that is also there. They send an old man along to take her along because that is the only way young men can't be trusted, kind of thing. Okay, so all these things are actually a kind of comic thing at the tradition, which was not there in the earlier movies. Actually making fun of this tradition, right? He's making fun of it, poking fun at it. It's a somewhat different thing. Okay. Now, this goblin cat is very important. Let us look at the last movie, which I think is this film. Let's go to the next one. Okay, Sancho the Bailiff. This I'll tell you why it's a great film. I tell you what my thing of this film is. It's probably the greatest of the film, simply because of its complexity. Now, in this story, a humane governor is banished to a far-off province. His wife is sold into prostitution in some island somewhere, and his children become slaves. They're sold off as slaves. Okay, their master is Sancho, who works for a minister. Okay, the Sancho is running a slave camp kind of thing. No, the Sancho is a very cruel fellow, but he's not a villain, right? He is doing the duties he's required to. He's heartless, but the point is, whatever task he's given to do, he's doing. Right? He's not an evil man. He has no likes, he has no dislikes. He's just discharging his obligations. His son, on the other hand, seems actually a decent fellow, right? Now, her own brother, there are two children, the brother and the sister. I think the son is Zushio and the daughter is Anju. They grow up. The Anju is okay, but the point is Zushio has grown up to be somewhat hard-hearted, right? He's a hard-hearted guy. He's grown up there. He's seen cruelty. He's seen this. So he's also become hard-hearted in some way. Okay, and he's become there. Okay, everything is going along fine until this goes along. Despite all the cruelty, they somehow manage. Yeah, you're right. This is an interesting question you're asking me. Why is the name Sancho the Bailiff? Sancho Dayu. I don't know the names that they translated. I don't know. Actually, this is an interesting question you're asking me. He's not the main character at all. Why is Sancho the? I don't know. Think about it. What is the thing? I think he's the pivotal. We'll discuss this. I mean, after we discuss this movie, we'll look at this. What exactly it could mean. Okay. The point is, at some point, at some moment, this they hear some song sung by some new entrant, and they find that the song has the word Anju and Zushio right there. Okay, that means they get the feeling, where are you from? She's that woman, old woman, is from the same whatever the same island where their mother was sold off to become a prostitute, right? So the result is that the song seems to have been sung by the mother. So they realize that the mother is still alive there, and that woman says that she's there, she so used to sing this song, and therefore, so they want to leave. This gives that son, the son Zushio, some reason to live, some reason, right? And then what happens is they decide to escape when they're supposed to escorting an old woman to leave her in some mountain where she'll be eaten by vultures, or by carrion, by crows and vultures. They'll be eating her. This is also there in Ballad of Narayama. She'll be eaten by them, and therefore they leave her there and they come off, and then he escapes. The daughter commits suicide. She says, "I'll wait for you," but she really knows that if she waits, she could be tortured and they'd find out where he has gone. Okay, now the important thing here is, this is like, that first step thing when irreversible things start happening. In a tragedy, if you take something like Hamlet, okay, when the irreversible things start happening, okay, like when Hamlet kills what's her name, Ophelia's father. He kills him accidentally, thinking he's a spy or something. He's an old man who's just hanging behind a curtain, so looking behind a curtain, and the man kills him. Then he starts. So the Ophelia's death would be some part where that kind of a gradual collapse. The order which Hamlet wants in some way to install to get justice for his father's death. But he starts putting things in motion. He starts putting things in motion, which get on their own steam, and it's not possible for him to reverse everything. You know very well that once he kills that father, that Ophelia's father, and Ophelia herself drowns, it's not possible. He can't. You see, one of the things about justice is melodrama and all this. One of the things in melodrama is, okay, that things are reversible in some way. It's not in the sense that you look for justice, you will find justice somewhere. Okay, the justice will reach some kind of justice. At least even in death, there is justice achieved, right? It is not like the story of Hamlet or a story of the Sancho the Bailiff, where justice is not reachable at all. There so many things have happened, so many things have been put into motion, right? That when you go to this, that it's not a question of reversing the past and attaining some kind of reversal of the past, but simply you've done something else, and everything is collapsed under that. Okay, you get me? This is the way, say, shall we, something Macbeth would work. This is the way Hamlet would work, and I think Sancho works like that. Not it has anything to do with Shakespeare, but the point here that after this thing, that what is the thing they want to set in motion in Sancho? Okay, Sancho the Bailiff. They want to set that the fact that they were actually people from an upper class, from a family of a governor, right? Therefore, by normal course, this governor's family, if the governor by some error he was killed, and I think he dies in exile or something, is exiled. The point is they want justice for themselves. They want the past to be somehow reversed in some way. But the point is, once Anju dies, okay, okay, that this entire thing you've set in thing, that you will not come back to any kind of semblance of the original condition. You will go to another condition completely, which has nothing to do with what you wanted restored. It's a basic thing, right? Now,
Yes.
what happens here is this Zushio manages to get some kind of thing about showing that he actually belongs to some kind of royal family, a governor's family, so he's entitled to a position. So he goes and he desperately tries to find his old position and back, and after, with great difficulty, with the help of Sancho's own son, he gets his position as a governor of some place. Okay, once he gets the position as a governor of some place, okay, what happens is he decides he is going to set right everything. But the point is this, okay, as a governor, he has got fewer powers than Sancho's patron has. See, Sancho is not working for himself. He's just an employee. He's got a lower position than this guy as governor. But the point is, the whose employee he is, that man, the minister of the interior or some such thing, is a powerful man. So the question is, this Zushio goes along to Sancho's people, directs his own people, you follow my orders. He's giving illegal orders, right? Okay. Zushio gives illegal orders, sets free all the slaves in Sancho's thing. Sancho is that's where Sancho is basically not a villain at all. Sancho knows you're a governor. Okay, you're a governor. I know. All right, you are here, but now you're a governor. Respect you for being a governor. You're above me, but you can't give orders like this because you don't have the authority to give orders like this. Okay. Actually, Zushio does not have authority to give orders like that. So he tells all these people, just look at this. He tells all these people, you're free from now on. Okay, all these slaves. And they go on the rampage, drinking. What do you expect to happen? Okay. He also knows, who this Zushio knows that he has no chance of actually carrying through this. He resigns his post as governor to look for his mother, right? Okay. Why does he resign his post? He knows he has given unlawful orders. What has he done? He has told his subordinates to act. Now, what will happen to the subordinates? Just imagine what could happen to the subordinates, right? He has given unlawful, he has compromised his subordinate. No, Mizoguchi does not look at any of this. Okay. He leaves them all this stuff without rounding it off. You are supposed to ask these questions. Now, the question is, he has done all kinds of things he is not required to, but the point is he's doing it in the right cause. He does not have the authority to direct his own subordinates to set free the slaves. The point is, will those subordinates be protected by the law? No, I doubt it. Okay. It's very unlikely they'll be protected by the law. It is likely Sancho, though he's sent off into exile, will be brought back and reinstalled there. Those slaves will probably be punished. He says, you're free from tomorrow, go away. But whatever he tells them is false. Now, the question is, you want to understand this, right? Zushio is actually on the side of right. He's just as Hamlet is on the side of right, Zushio is on the side of the right. Okay. In that, he is giving orders which are morally correct. They're morally correct, but legally wrong. Right? So that's what he does. So the question is, after this happens, all these illegalities he results in. Now the point is, this whole thing are a series of irrational, illegal things. He gives this up, goes there, gives it up, looking for his mother, and he goes to that island there. His father, he finds out his father died some years ago. He was in exile. He died some years ago. His mother is there. Mother tried to escape at some particular point. Her tendons of her legs have been cut. She can no longer move. Okay. She can no longer move anywhere. Okay. So the good thing is, since she can no longer move, she is there and she's gone mad. She's no longer even competent to be a prostitute. She sits on some beach somewhere singing that song. Okay. When he goes there, she doesn't even recognize that he's the person, right? She doesn't recognize. He goes on telling her, nothing gets into her head, right? She's completely mad. Nothing goes into her head. He's trying to, so the entire thing of what he is doing is trying to reassure her, I'm your son, I'm there for you, I'll look after you, don't worry. But the point is, she's not in a position even to absorb that, right? You get me? Okay. So he has set in a motion of events which he has no control over. They're illegal, and in the process, it's implicated other people to come and to deal with, to do all kinds of illegalities which they were not entitled to. Now the question is, it's like you just look at it. Okay, the Japanese, just look at this. Okay, the Japanese in World War II followed orders, right? Okay, war crimes, they were executed. Okay, following orders. Just remember that. Yeah, prostitute is his own sister was a geisha, right? So this entire condition of the women there, this geisha was an institution. It still is in Japan. So the question is, because his own thing about his own sister, that seems to have made a deep impact on him. You won't find this geisha as a character in a Ozu film, but it happens frequently in I don't think I don't think the geisha features as an element in the Ozu film at all, as far as I know. Okay. But Mizoguchi, film after film after film, that is, I think Street of Shame also another film you should watch. Again about prostitutes, geishas, courtesans, this sort of thing. Street of Shame. Okay, but the point is that this is the thing. So the thing is, like as in Hamlet, he in a melodrama, the basic difference in a melodrama is that there is some kind of reversal. There is some kind of reversal of the thing that in the sense that a disturbed order is somehow restored. Okay, if you take something like say Great Expectations, an order is there, some kind of order is that order is destroyed or some such thing, that finally there various things take place, poetic justice happens, something is restored. There are something which will not be reversed obviously, but prices are paid, and finally there's an emotional reconciliation of some sort. There's a restoration of an old thing of some sort. There is some happy ending of some sort happens, right? Not in something like Hamlet, where once you start, though the cause is just, what he wants to do is just, he sets into motion all kinds of elements which destroy everything, right? Similarly, in Sancho the Bailiff, the Zushio sets into motion events which cannot be reversed, right? So the question is, it's that collapse, that whole sense of collapse of a system, collapse of intention. Your intention will no longer, whether the tradition will not support. Tradition is itself flawed. Okay, tradition is flawed. Okay, and because tradition is flawed, whatever action you may take, even morally justified action, will not work. Okay, it will not work. So the question is, what will be his own future? Just look at Zushio's thing. Mizoguchi does not ask these questions in the film, but he has created asymmetries. He's created irreversible conditions. When you go on saying sister will not come back, sister has committed suicide, the Sancho has been exiled, but you know very well he's going to come back. All these people who have been freed are going to be back in slavery next day or so. This person's, this Zushio's subordinates who followed his orders will probably suffer terrible fates, right? Mizoguchi does not ask these questions, but he creates a situation when you are forced to ask these questions. You don't find this kind of thing in the earlier movies. You get my point? Okay. So Mizoguchi has created a completely thing. It's actually, in some sense, some kind of allegory of, it's a kind of the collapse of tradition, right? Tradition is not reliable anymore. And you can actually see this following orders, obeying orders, doing something on your own. You have the right to, there could be some reflection on the war also. Okay, that this thing of war crimes trials, when generals and that were executed for their whatever, or people who were following orders were executed. There is this interesting film by Oshima called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. See that also. I would suggest you see that interesting film, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. You can have a look at that film also. Okay. So this is the basic thing which I think that Sancho is a great film. Okay. It's probably the greatest of. Um, Life of Oharu is also a great film. But Life of Oharu doesn't have this kind of complexity, right? It doesn't have that. Since it is dealing entirely with one person's destiny, one person's fate, and one person's story. Here it is not that. He's dealing with a system, he's doing it. It's a much more, shall we say, it's a much more complicated and a complex film than Life of Oharu. Which is why I think it's a great film, okay? Because I mean, you find that what the kind of stuff he's done here, it's a completely different picture of tradition or whatever. And if you look at his earlier movies and you look at these movies, you can find this difference. Now let us look at this question of Sancho. Why do you think? What do you think? Give me some idea. Why don't you guys come up with some idea? Why do you think Sancho the Bailiff is the title of the film? What do you think is the reason? Can you give me some idea?
So, what I think is because the major cause of the film is Sancho, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
I
otherwise there
think
would be no
I
film.
think that's what I think. I think he stands in the fulcrum of the film. It is
Yeah,
not that he's important as a character,
yeah,
okay, but his position in the film, everything revolves around him, right? He's a kind of fulcrum there. So all activity goes on around him, right? I don't know exactly how these titles were given. Now you have a look at Japanese paintings. Have a look at Japanese. Just look at Japanese paintings. What are the kind of look at the narrative paintings in Japan? Have a look at it, right? And how these paintings are given. It is not what is specifically shown in the picture. Okay, it could be, I mean, they could show a man and a woman, or they could show something else. It would be something else which would, shall we say, a kind of key to the whole story, right? It could be that, right? So you have a look at it, look at the way. It's a very interesting question why he has done that. Obviously, it's the same thing, and I told you earlier, right, that the Japanese narration is a different kind of thing. What exactly the narration is, the way it works in a Japanese film is very different. Japanese painting is it's always there with the painting. You have this thing of the written text and all that. You have a look at what this, I think what you can say about Sancho is, rather than Mother, rather than Zushio, rather than Anju, and look at Oyama, rather than all of them, he is at the fulcrum of the film, right? He is around him, the whole story moves. He is the person who reacts to the, who is responsible for all the kind of thing, and his cruelty, his thing is responsible for Zushio and Anju being what they are. So that being the fulcrum of the thing, sort of, shall we say, engineering the action in some way may be the reason. Though he does not play such a big role. But it could, this thing of why this is Sancho is the title of the film could give you some kind of thing on traditional Japanese cinema. Look at the kind of titles that, what's his name, Ozu gives. Look at the story of the last chrysanthemums. What do you make of the story of the last chrysanthemums? What is the title? Okay. Sisters of Jian, okay. It makes some sense. It's about the sisters. One is one way, the other is story of the last chrysanthemum. Floating weeds. What does one make of floating weeds? Okay. So I think I don't know if any study has ever been made of the titles of Japanese movies. What is the relationship? It may be interesting to look at the titles of Japanese movies. Okay, whereas your Kurosawa's movies that have much more straightforward titles, right? Okay, Rashomon, it's that gate where all these guys meet. Seven Samurai, you know very well what it is. Okay. Okay, then all these Kurosawa films have very conventional titles, understandable titles, straightforward titles. Mizoguchi no, Ozu no. So have a look at this man's another look at the titles of what's his name, Naruse, Mikio Naruse. Have a look at his titles also. Okay, whereas your Kobayashi's titles are fairly straightforward. Samurai Rebellion, Harakiri, okay. They are fairly straightforward titles, okay. Whereas these earlier titles are not straightforward. You will have to look at the role of look at the titles of pictures. And this is an interesting subject. Look at the title of pictures in Japanese paintings. What exactly? They would all have titles. How do the titles work? And look at the thing. Does it work in that particular way in terms of the narration and all that? That'd be interesting. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you. Okay.
Okay,
All
sir.
right. We'll stop here. Right. Thanks a lot.